And so what I'm going to do first is talk about more of the summary of how we got to where we're at in Minnesota, and basically, the current status of Palmer. Jeff Gonzalez is going to come up and talk more about our process and how we've been working with the landowners to actually address the issue. Denise Steed will talk about the seed pathway and some of the things we've learned through there, because that's been very important to our situation in Minnesota. And then Dan Shaw from Bowser will talk more about some best management practices, at least related to the seed pathway. So Minnesota's story really starts from an infestation level in 2016. However, it actually goes back to a tie-in with Iowa when they first had their finds in 2013. As Tom sort of mentioned, we do have a noxious weed advisory committee that advises the Commissioner of Ag on how the noxious weed program should run, as well as what species should be listed and regulated. And in 2013, when we heard about Palmer coming into Iowa, and knowing how it's been spreading and watching it over the last couple decades, we added it to our noxious weed list. And we did that for one primary reason, so that we could act on it quickly once it did come into the state. And we knew that it wasn't an issue of, if, it was when it was going to come into Minnesota. So we were able to list it in 2014, and by 2016, when it was first found in the state, we were able to act on it very quickly. Our initial infestations came through the conservation planting pathway, primarily through contaminated seed. In that 2016 time frame, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and several other states had also reported this same situation. And initially, we got one report out in Yellow Medicine County, or Lyon County, I believe it was first, and that turned into about 33 sites. And so one thing we do know is that from our seed investigations up to this point, although we'll never probably know the true source of where that seed came from, exactly where it came out of into Minnesota, we're pretty confident that those seed issues were related to one company. And that also continued into 2017, where we had infestations also. In 2018, the most significant thing that we were fearful of is we don't want it getting into the row crop system, although we knew it eventually would find its way in there. And so we've got our first two finds in soybean fields, in one field in Redwood County and one field in Jackson. And we just found out through some testing of some sunflower screenings that were used as livestock feed, that there could be a tie-in at least between our Redwood County site and sites in North Dakota. Livestock were fed sunflower screenings that were contaminated with Palmer in both cases. So quite interesting that we did find in screenings we tested a positive for Palmer Amaranth. The key point here, though, is not to be focused on the seed pathway. That was kind of how things started, at least in our state as we know it. However, the Jackson County and the Redwood County finds show us that it's coming from all kinds of different pathways, most likely, and will continue to. So we need to be vigilant on a lot of different means of spread than just focusing on one. So to use the Iowa example, and I'm going to follow it up with what's going on in Minnesota, you'll see some similarities. But what I want to point out is from 2013, when it was first found in Iowa, to 2015, the state primarily had 5 counties infested. And these infestations came from means outside of the seed pathway. But they were able to contain those until we jumped to 2016. As I mentioned, that was Minnesota's first year. And you see all these red dots, or red X's on that map, and those are related to conservation plantings. So this, again, was the seed pathway where all it took was one contaminated lot to get spread over a large area. And you can see you go from 5 counties, pretty stable over a 2-year period, to 30 counties like nothing. Again, it wasn't all into row crop fields, but what surrounds all those CRP areas, and that's the concern. Further into 2017, 2018, and you can see how things have spread in Iowa. Now in Minnesota, it's not quite the same number of counties, and I'll explain this final colored map better later on in my presentation. But we started with 2 counties in 2016 through the seed pathway. It multiplied to 2 more counties up in North Central in 2017. And then this year, 2018, the 2 brown colored counties in the Southwest are our 2 soybean field finds. So there's also some sites that we've investigated where we didn't find Palmer, but we were suspicious either through seed or through reports that Palmer may be there. So again, the big thing now is that things kind of changed for me and Jeff in the way we were handling this. Whereas MDA was taking more of a direct role on the CRP, non-egg land type management. Now we get it in soybean fields, and we really need to amass both our resources. Where MDA was primarily showing up to document the site, scout around the sites, and try to genetically confer that it was Palmer. And one thing I'll tell you, Minnesota doesn't have a lot of Palmer amaranth. And so I've seen many experts sitting around one plant and try to say, is this water hemp or is this Palmer? We've had reports through pictures that look exactly like they're Palmer, and we test them and they turn out they're not. So genetic testing is a very important part of what we're doing in Minnesota to confirm. And I think we had 4 plants in the Redwood County soybean field, and 2 of those tested positive for Palmer. We did have one female plant in Jackson County, okay? And so when you see these maps all filled with colors, because that's kind of how we describe things, doesn't mean the whole county is overfilled with the plant. And so we're really dealing with a needle in a haystack here. And that's kind of the point of today. That's a good thing to have, because once you start having a lot of Palmer amaranth, your seed bank's building up, right? Your spread is increasing. We don't want to get to that level if we possibly can. So we also had Shane Blair, our main person from our group at MDA, out surveying not just the field itself intensively, but sort of doing a 5-mile radius the best that he could. And you got to remember, we don't have an army of people, and nor does Extension, when you compare it to the geographic area as we're dealing with here. So we're really relying a lot on the farmers themselves and the people in those areas. So to kind of give you just a rundown, we started with CRP plantings. We had 42 the first year, or between the first 2 years in Yellow Medicine, Lyon, Todd, and Douglas counties. The good news is that through scouting in 2018 on all those sites, we have had no reemergence of Palmer amaranth. Is that a testament to the quick approach we took to get out there? We did a lot of flame weeding to knock down seed load. We did an intensive amount of scouting and hand pulling, as well as herbicide treatments and so forth. And by the way, FSA and NRCS were very helpful to allow us to do those kinds of things on CRP lands, which you normally cannot do under contract. So we were able to bat down the Palmer, but I will say this, let's don't underestimate the power of the native species that were growing on those sites. We've never really been concerned so much about Palmer taking over CRP lands or native plantings as much as we've been concerned about those plants being able to reproduce for enough years before the native vegetation does fill in, that we have this huge seed bank that's leaching into the corn or the soybean acres. So now we have 2 soybean fields. Those were positive finds. They're not really related to one another as far as we know. One I mentioned in Redwood could be a result of manure. The one in Jackson, we're not really sure. It's 20 feet from a windmill access road, and those companies work around the region. They also bring gravel in on those roads, and the farmer that we talked with thought that could be the source They always complain about every time they bring new gravel in, there's a new bunch of weeds growing around. But we don't know that for sure. And then we did have some additional reports that were coming in late this year. So we had a lot of farmers that called and said, hey, I think I had palmer, but I couldn't get to you right away because harvest was just happening. And that's the problem with this plant, is it's easiest to identify when farmers are getting busy and trying to cut and harvest during the fall. We did have 3 of those specific farmers that sent us pictures they had taken before they hopped on the combine to harvest, and they sure looked like palmer. 2 of them tested out to be, I believe, water hemp, or not positive for palmer. The 3rd one we don't know, because by the time we got there it had already been disked under. But regardless, all of these sites will be looked at in the future. Just to give you a little anecdote about on the CRP acres, these 6 bags, I believe Monica Chandler, my colleague, who's been very instrumental in the success of this, they went out in 2017 on those 33 locations we had in Yellow Medicine and Lyon, and I think only 3 of those sites had any palmer reemerge, and they all fit into those bags that we took off site and destroyed. So we've taken a very proactive stance on this, and you can't underestimate. I know Jeff's going to talk about the extension role on this, but extension has been shadowing us, or we've been shadowing them, depending on who it made more sense to take the lead on a particular issue throughout this whole process. So if we're out bagging up plants of stuff, Jeff and his crew have been talking with those farmers about, okay, what are the next steps? What do we need to do? What types of things should you consider in the next planting season, and so forth. This is the wrong title, so disregard that. But basically, this is from a presentation I just gave on Friday. But the information in the slide is correct. We've had 3 locations where palmer amaranth was either found in the seed test, and it turned out that it was not in the field itself. So that's been a good thing. However, I'll show you in this map of Minnesota, all of those yellow counties are where these locations exist. So we're putting them on the map so that you understand we still have to go to those locations and survey. They've been reported. We don't know did we luck out last year? There's those 4 counties up in the northwestern part of the state. That's a huge amount of acreage, isn't it? Like 1,400 acres, Denise. So we still have to scout all those areas, and that you can kind of see there's a point of diminishing returns here where we can't physically get out to every site to scout it as intensively as we would like to. I also want to point out that we're not just doing the call and response thing. Oh, I've got palmer, and we show up to your site. Through our egg pest surveys at MDA over the last several years in soybeans, as you can see through 2018 on this map, and also in corn. I think this past year was our first year doing that. We have staff that are out scouting fields randomly throughout the state and looking for diseases and other pest issues, and they're also looking for palmer amaranth. And we've spent some time with those staff before they go out to show them the key characteristics of palmer. So far, we haven't found any palmer in these surveys. And that, Minnesota's a big state. Those dots look bigger than they are once you zoom in. Are we statistically covering what we need to? Probably not, but we're doing the best we can, and the fact that we haven't found any in random surveys tells me that if palmer is more widespread than we know it is, it's probably at a fairly low level right now. So we're asking, and Jeff will reiterate some of this because it's part of our our plan of attack here, letting growers and folks know that are out there that own land, learn to identify the pigweeds, become familiar with them. It's not the easiest set of plants for the novice to just pick up and try to learn, but once you get familiar with it, you start to see the differences, and I think Mark Renz has done a good video that you can download or look at from YouTube showing the differences between the key amaranths. The other thing is if you suspect a plant, call either Jeff, the extension educators out there, MDA, or maybe your crop consultant. They know how to get through to us. Jeff's done a good job through his network to get the word out to crop consultants, and we get a lot of feedback from them. The other thing is if you're buying seed of any kind, try to coordinate either with MDA or Bowser and understand what's in the label and know how to read it, know how to source your material, know how to talk with the person you're buying the seed from. The reputable seed dealers in this state, and they are the majority, and there are many of them, they will help you. They're there to give you the best quality seed they possibly can. And if you have anything that you think is suspicious or doesn't seem right, let us know. Either the weed program, myself, or Denise. Let us know right away. We can go out and investigate and look into, is something funny going on here, and do we need to get involved? If you believe that there's a contractor or a vendor out there that's doing anything that is risky or could be potentially spreading things around that we don't want, let us know about that also. The one thing I want to emphasize here is Palmer Amaranth is not the only weed we're going to ever deal with. And in fact, Palmer might be a case study for the future of weed management in the Midwest. And so the idea behind this meeting isn't just to focus on Palmer, although that's kind of the poster child, but is to prepare ourselves, because a lot of these pathways are going to be the same, okay? And the thing we know, and Bev mentioned earlier, with herbicide resistance, we're seeing an increase with that, and that's going to become more troublesome for agriculture as we move forward. So this is a chance for us to develop something that, that hopefully can work for all. The last thing I want to leave you all with is just something we already all know, but I don't think it can be emphasized enough. All of the Palmer identified in the state of Minnesota has come from a farmer, all right? It's not the MDA out there scouting around and finding it. We are responding to them, and we need them, all right? We need farmers at every step along the way to report Palmer and to get active with it and not be afraid to report it. We're going to talk a lot about stakeholders and ways to increase research and boots on the ground and all that kind of stuff today, but whatever we do, we got to make sure that farmers are involved every step of the way with this, because they're going to be the ones that determine whether we succeed at this or not. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and I'm going to hold off questions until we get through this section of talks, just to kind of